And don't let some of these politicians go around saying, because I'm telling you, these countries are calling us kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal.
And as countries seek other export markets, that's going to reduce the supply to U.S. market.
The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over.
Countries like Germany, Canada, partnership with the European Union can provide stability and prosperity for its citizens.
Trump's tariffs have not only shaken North America, they have triggered a chain reaction across the world's most trusted alliances. Suddenly, countries that once treated the U.S. as their default partner are quietly rewriting the rules. India, Germany, Japan, France, and Australia, 5 economic pillars spanning 4 continents, are now looking elsewhere for stability, and the destination they keep circling back to is Canada. India, hit the hardest by sudden tariff hikes, has already begun testing Canada as a safer alternative. Germany, wary of strategic uncertainty, increasingly frames Canada as a low-risk partner, not just for consumer goods, but for critical minerals. Japan has opened its shelves to Canadian products and, for the first time, welcomed liquefied natural gas from the port of Kitimat. In France, consumer markets are tilting toward Canadian green goods, leaving American brands to appear outdated. And in Australia, a 22-year ban on Canadian beef has quietly been lifted, while Canadian fashion brands creep into spaces once dominated by Levi's and Gap. But what does it mean when 5 of America's closest partners all begin shifting their trust, their contracts, and their shelves toward Ottawa instead of Washington? Could this be the first sign that economic loyalty is being re-anchored, not by power, but by predictability? Before we begin, hit that like button if you're finding this eye-opening. It really helps us beat the algorithm. If Canada is emerging as a safe harbor, it's because others are being pushed into the storm. Nowhere is this clearer than in India, where the weight of Washington's tariff policy has landed with brutal force. As one of Asia's fastest-growing economies, India has long depended on access to U.S. markets to fuel its export engine. Yet Trump's decision to raise tariffs, first 25%, then doubling to 50%, struck directly at that dependency. Analysts estimate that as much as $48.2 billion worth of Indian goods are now exposed, from textiles and leather to gems and processed foods. The consequences are already visible. India's total merchandise exports fell to just $35.1 billion in August 2025, the lowest level in 9 months. Processed food tells an even sharper story. U.S. exports into India slid by 17%, while Canadian shipments surged nearly 31% over the same period. What was once America's foothold in a vital sector now appears to be Canada's opening. The Modi government has pledged not to bow under pressure, signaling instead that it will accelerate new partnerships across the Middle East, Africa, and the European Union. But the deeper question lingers. If India's growth path is forced to reroute, will the country remember Canada as the partner that stepped in when Washington stepped back? If you've made it this far, you probably care. Consider subscribing to stay updated. While India scrambles to shield its exports, Germany has taken a very different path, one of deliberate realignment. As Europe's economic backbone, Berlin is unwilling to tolerate the kind of uncertainty that has crept into transatlantic trade. Instead, it has started to frame Canada as its new rear guard, both in everyday consumer goods and in the far more strategic realm of critical resources. German retailers were among the first to react. Faced with U.S. products flagged for chemical additives banned under EU law, they began shifting procurement toward Canadian alternatives. Within just 6 months, imports from Canada climbed an estimated 33%, reshaping shelves in supermarkets and department stores alike. But the shift does not stop at consumer goods. On August 26, 2025, Ottawa and Berlin signed a sweeping agreement that bundled together some of the most valuable inputs for the global energy transition: lithium, rare earths, copper, tungsten, gallium, germanium, and nickel. To oversee and deepen this cooperation, Canada appointed Isabella Chan as its special envoy, while Germany designated Matthias Kohler, signals that both sides view this not as a temporary transaction, but as the beginning of a long-term political and economic bond. Backing those commitments are Canadian mining firms like Troilus Gold, Torngat Metals, and Rocktech Lithium, which have already signed supply deals with German industrial giants. For Germany, the calculation is simple. In a world where supply chains can be weaponized, Canada represents not just a friendly partner, but a dependable lifeline. If Germany is turning to Canada to secure its industrial backbone, Japan is doing the same to protect its most fragile lifeline, energy. On June 30, 2025, the Gaslog Glasgow departed from Kitimat, British Columbia, carrying liquefied natural gas bound for Japan. For Tokyo, it was more than a shipment, it was a geopolitical milestone. For the first time, Japan could reduce its dependence on U.S. supply routes and diversify through a direct Pacific link to Canadian resources. Yet the pivot has not been limited to energy. Japanese regulators, increasingly strict about consumer health, flagged a series of U.S. goods for excessive artificial additives, undercutting trust in American brands. The timing was telling. Between January and June 2025, Canadian exports to Japan rose by an estimated 17%, while U.S. products saw a noticeable decline. That shift is visible in daily life. Major chains like Aeon and Ito-Yokado have expanded shelf space for Canadian goods. Granola, oats, organic toothpaste, once niche items that now represent an image of safety and reliability. For Japan, the logic mirrors its energy calculus. When stability is scarce, Canada is a partner worth betting on. If Japan's shift was driven by energy security and consumer safety, France's pivot reflects something more cultural, the growing power of sustainability. French shoppers are increasingly skeptical of U.S. products, viewing them as outdated and environmentally careless, while Canadian goods are stepping neatly into the gap. The warning signs had already appeared in 2024, when France's Directorate General for Competition, Consumer Affairs and Fraud Control flagged multiple American brands for failing to meet packaging and environmental standards. That moment eroded confidence in U.S. labels and opened space for alternatives. Retailers wasted no time. Chains like Carrefour, Monoprix, and Naturalia increased their Canadian imports by more than 30% within a matter of months, filling shelves with products that carried a cleaner image. The numbers speak clearly. Canadian household goods imports into France rose an estimated 26%, while American equivalents dropped nearly 18%. Behind those figures are brands that embody what French consumers now expect. Attitude, Green Beaver, and Maison Orphée, with their recycled packaging, cruelty-free certifications, and transparent ingredients, are gaining traction as symbols of a modern, sustainable identity. In contrast, U.S. products are left with the stigma of being less adaptable to the standards of a European market that prizes environmental responsibility above all. While France highlights the cultural divide between old and new consumer standards, Australia illustrates how quickly markets can swing once barriers come down. For decades, the country was considered a natural backyard for American goods. Yet in 2025, Canberra made a symbolic decision that reshaped the playing field. On July 29th, it lifted a 22-year ban on Canadian beef imports. That single move reopened doors for Canadian ranchers and signaled to Australian consumers that Ottawa's agricultural standards could be trusted again. Almost immediately, Canadian beef began competing for shelf space once dominated by U.S. suppliers, challenging an assumption that American products were unshakably entrenched in the market. But the pivot did not end at the dinner table. In fashion retail, Canadian brands are also on the rise. Sales of Canadian apparel jumped an estimated 28% across Australia's largest cities, while iconic U.S. names like Levi's and Gap suffered a 15% decline. The impact has been tangible. Gap was forced to close 3 locations, and Levi's lost a key logistics contract that once underpinned its regional distribution. Local retailers have moved to capture the shift. Department stores such as David Jones have signed partnerships with Canadian brands like Roots, Ten Tree, and Joe Fresh, valuing their adaptability to climate needs and their appeal to younger, sustainability-conscious consumers. In effect, Canada is no longer just a substitute. It is becoming a preference. Australia's pivot underscores a broader truth. America is no longer guaranteed a place in the global marketplace. Tariff policies that were designed to protect domestic industries are instead leaving the U.S. increasingly isolated as contracts slip away and supply chains reorganize without it. In supermarkets across Asia and Europe, American labels are being replaced, quietly but steadily, by Canadian ones. What was once the default choice in processed food Household goods, and even energy is now being edged out by brands carrying the maple leaf. The numbers tell the story. U.S. processed food exports to India have dropped an estimated 17%. Household goods sales in France are down nearly 18%, and American fashion in Australia has slid by 15%. This erosion is more than commercial, it is reputational. Made in USA once stood for strength and reliability, but now it increasingly signals inconsistency and higher risk. By contrast, Made in Canada is becoming shorthand for transparency, environmental responsibility, and trustworthiness. Even Japan, one of Washington's closest security allies, has begun sourcing liquefied natural gas directly from Kitimat, a symbolic reduction in its energy reliance on the U.S. The picture emerging is stark. Shelves once filled with American goods are not empty, but they no longer belong to America. Instead, they are being quietly restocked by its northern neighbor. If the current trajectory holds, the U.S. may be steering itself into isolation while Canada quietly emerges as the unspoken replacement. Every tariff shock that Washington delivers seems to hand its rivals an opening, and Ottawa a fresh opportunity. Across the G7 and in India, market share that once belonged firmly to America is gradually giving way to Canadian suppliers. What was framed as America First is increasingly perceived abroad as America Alone, reshaping not only contracts and supply chains, but the very trust that underpins global trade. And so, the deeper question remains, is this merely a trade dispute, or the first step in a global power shift, one triggered not by foreign rivals, but by Washington's own miscalculations? That's where we leave today's story, with shelves being restocked, alliances recalibrated, and Canada rising in places no one expected just a few years ago. But the question lingers. If America's allies are already pivoting away, how far could this domino effect reach, and who might be next to choose Ottawa over Washington? Thanks for sticking around. If you found this valuable, like and subscribe to support more content like this.